Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast, where we talk with the people behind the current events and breakthroughs in brain implants in an understandable way, helping bring together various fields involved in neuroprosthetics. Here is your host, Giovanni Lauricella.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast. Today's guest is Giovanni Lauricella, and he's actually a repeat guest. He's already been on the show. He was talking about recruiting before, recruiting for your MedTech startup, and he has a special affinity, special love, place in his heart for neurotechnology. And so we've hit it off personally, professionally over the last few years, and he's definitely helped out with a lot of projects that I've been working on. But I brought him back on to tie a bow around something that he mentioned last time and started talking about, but we ran out of time. But definitely need to talk about this other half of the projects that he works on, which is basically raising money for MedTech startups, basically getting venture capital, VC funding for MedTech startups and especially neurotechnology. So Giovanni, thanks so much for coming on the show. And yeah, do you want to introduce yourself again a little bit? And then you're doing something different now. You're working in a different place than you were last time we talked, which was maybe 9 months ago, I think.
Something like that. Yeah. Thank you very much for having me on again, Leighton. I really appreciate it. So I lead a firm called Lifeblood Capital. And just a quick history on the name of the company, which will ultimately get into why we're doing two podcasts, one on talent acquisition and one on fundraising. I actually host a podcast myself called MedTech Money, where we interview investors who invest in MedTech startups. And we also interview entrepreneurs who have successfully raised capital so we can talk about those journeys. And on each episode that I host, the first question that I ask every guest is, do you believe that people and money are the lifeblood of a MedTech startup? And in essence, people and money are the lifeblood of any startup, but it's a MedTech focused podcast. And so the two cores that you need, obviously, right beyond the technology, and of course there's passion, et cetera, but you need people to be able to actually grow and hit those tractions and milestones that the company is growing with. But in order to do that, you need money. And hence, lifeblood is people and money for a startup. And then you have the human capital component, you have the financial capital component to it. So our firm is called Lifeblood Capital. And what we focus in is solely MedTech startups. We do this on a global basis. And fundamentally, we are a recruitment firm that supplies talent acquisition services to global MedTech startups. In addition to the fact that over the years, through being hired by VCs to put in CEOs and executive change management into their portfolio companies, we've amassed this investor network over the years, of which probably for the past handful of years, it became obvious that we were simply going to leverage our investor network and help out these startups be able to get connected with the right investor. So think about it like matchmaking. Talent acquisition, you find people to go into a company. And on the fundraising side, you find startups to go with the investors. And it's almost a very similar methodology. That's what we do. In terms of helping them out with fundraising strategies, we're not investment bankers, but what we do is help typically earlier stage startups either go through their pitch decks, understand on simply how to create an investable story, and walk them through some of the watch outs and don't do's and must do's so that they can have a bit more of a smoother journey in their capital raise. So people on the talent acquisition side and building teams, and fundraising strategies for MedTech startups who ultimately are looking to go raise money.
Yeah, awesome. I think that's a great way to do it. And I think that's a great question to ask somebody is actually, yeah, I guess which one's more important, would you say, or are they equally important?
I think at the end of the day, and all the podcasts I've done, there's only so much sweat equity. And I've come across and know a lot of entrepreneurs who have put 1, 2, maybe even 3 years with some sweat equity into an idea and concept to turn it into a company. Ultimately, the people are carrying it. But it gets to an inflection point that obviously at some point you need money to move forward. So both are ideal and vital, but not being the one to say it myself, but all the guests on my podcast, they always just come back to you need both, but people are everything, which I fully and wholeheartedly agree.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so how do you raise money in a MedTech startup? I've seen the TV show Silicon Valley, and they have some hijinks there where they're going through some of the investment things that go on. But this is more Silicon Valley, apps, all this kind of stuff. But MedTech raising is different, isn't it?
Very different. Yeah, very, very different. And also, not to make it more complicated, but we are seeing within MedTech industries converge. And there was a great podcasts, as well as an experience that I had with Andreas Forsland, who's the CEO of Cognition. And the story that I was able to pull out of him really highlighted these convergence of these markets. So he's developing an external brain-computer interface. But if you look at how he raised his $12 million seed round, it was from MedTech investors. It was from high-tech investors. It was from consumer investors. And so it really just ultimately depends. I think the industry itself has moved past simply a mechanical medical device. And now we're starting to see a lot more consumerism come in, a lot more pharma come in, to sometimes even drug discovery on the software side. So there's these blending of these industries that are now coming in, and they're falling under this very gray umbrella of medtech. So you have to understand where you fall on that spectrum and really what you are. But what I would say is there is very saliently clear, dedicated investors to the space. And some of them are life science investors who happen to do medtech. We've also seen a massive genesis of investors who are generalists come into the medtech space throughout COVID, especially now that healthcare is in the highlight, or I should say the limelight. But in terms of how to raise capital, I'll use all the guests that told me directly, and I'll speak through their words, is you have to know what you are and where you fall. And there's such a thing as good money versus bad money. And of course, in earlier stages, when you're dealing with angel groups or high net worth individuals who maybe are passion projects, they just simply have an interest in there, but they're not necessarily the guru where you're going to get extra added benefit beyond the capital. That typically you hear a lot more of that when you start getting into professional investors like venture capitalists, et cetera. You have to understand where you fall in that spectrum, and this notion of good money versus bad money. You take bad money, it really could ruin a company. Good money, simplistically saying, is you find an investor who really knows how to add value to your company beyond simply writing you a check. And oftentimes, when you start getting into the granularity behind that, there's medtech entrepreneurs, or I should say investors out there, who invest only in class 3 devices. They are very loud and clear that they like the hard stuff, and they're willing to go along for the long ride of class 3 and PMAs and the 7 to 10 journey potentially. And then there's other ones who they want a quick fix, right? They want to get an exit in 2 or 3 years. And so maybe they don't go into class 3s. They typically hang around the class 2s, and they need to see some sort of experienced entrepreneur who really knows the timelines and can methodically build a company. Investing, what I've learned is, and once again, in the opener of my podcast, is I say to everybody, what I've learned is that there's no magic or silver bullet or equation or simple formula to be able to raise capital. It really is a journey that's quite unique. However, it boils down to 2 main things that I would suggest to any entrepreneur who's looking to raise money, which is, if you're an entrepreneur or CEO and you're running the company, networking is your number 1 skill. If you're afraid of networking, because ultimately raising capital is a sales gig, it's sales at the end of the day. That's what it is. And if you're not used to 1,000 no's and only 1 yes, and it's just not in your DNA, find somebody who's going to lead your company. And if you want to go for that journey, then just don't take it to heart, and just know that it's a methodical process. Ultimately, it feels like a numbers game, but it does get a little bit more sophisticated than that when you start doing the industry research. You do due diligence on the investors. You make it a 2-way street, just like you are getting due diligence by the investor. The entrepreneur should certainly do due diligence and ask strong questions back to the investor to understand what that long-term partnership's ultimately going to be. What value are you going to bring? What investments have you made that are similar? Do you have that experience on joining my journey for this 510K or for this PMA or for this de novo product? Do you have, Mr. Investor, Mrs. Investor, do you have the network to support me and my company's growth? Things like that. So networking, and also taking the time to actually do due diligence on the investor landscape to reach out to the appropriate investors, are probably 2 of the key things that I would suggest to any entrepreneur.
Yeah, for sure. That's definitely a huge thing. And yeah, you got to be a salesman essentially. And it's very difficult for a lot of these people that are spinning off companies from the lab. They've been trained their entire lives to be scientists, and this is a completely different thing. Hey guys, just a quick pause to talk about our show sponsor, Iris Biomedical. Iris Biomedical provides a portfolio of neural sensing and simulation platforms and components to accelerate early-stage medical device companies through preclinical and early feasibility studies. Iris is an ideal partner for companies with limited budgets or resources to invest in developing a new platform from the ground up. Their experienced engineering team, in-house cleanroom facilities, and ISO 13485 certified quality management system allow for prototyping and early-stage commercial production. Be sure to tell them you heard about it on the Neural Implant Podcast. That'll really help us out. Thanks. Now, back to the show. So you were talking about good money versus bad money. What's the difference? What does that mean? What is an example of bad money, and like how bad can bad get?
Oh, bad can get bad. So bad money, I'll give you a real world example. When you take money from an investor, ultimately investors have to return, and I'm speaking specifically about venture capital at this point. There's obviously nuances with varying types of investors, but if we just talk about venture capital, at the end of the day, when venture capitalists take on limited partners who invest in their fund in order to deploy the money into startups, they have to return that money. And there's typically a 10-year horizon that's most common. And throughout that 10 years, typically they invest the majority, if not all of the money within the first 2, 3, maybe 4 years of the fund. And then they start going into management mode on the back end for the remainder of that. And they have to get those exits so that they ultimately return the money back to the LPs, which is the reason why they invested into the venture capitalists to begin with. If all of a sudden that timeline is creating pressure internally on the investor, and they have to say, okay, I know we invested in these 3 companies and none of them are seemingly close to an exit. Maybe one had to do a turnaround and maybe they needed a bridge round and now we're getting further diluted or not even close to any sort of exit. Like we don't even see the light at the end of the tunnel. All of a sudden, there's possibly this scrambling effort where if that investor who invested in that startup happens to take a board seat, that board member who's an investor might have different motivations than the other board members on the board for the company. And especially if the CEO is on the board, where that CEO has a fiduciary responsibility to be able to actually push the company forward, grow it properly, add value. And that adding value process might take longer than the timeline of the investor who happens to be a board member. And all of a sudden, that's when you start seeing some of these contentious moments on boards where there's these different motivations and maybe the board members pushing to sell it quickly or just, and not necessarily even at the best price, just because they have to return something, even if it's break even. They don't want to lose money. So bad money, that's just one particular example. There's other examples where you take money from an investor and literally as soon as you take the money from the investor who owns a significant portion of the company now, which wasn't talked about throughout due diligence, wants to drastically change the strategy of the company. I even heard of an entrepreneur, I actually have only heard this once, but once was enough. They took money from an investor. It was seemingly immediate that the investor wanted to do something drastically different than the founders and other board members had ever an intention for the company. And it was going to be oil and water. And it really was very quickly. And there was like enough of a window where the entrepreneur actually gave the money back to the investor simply because that's bad money. That's money that you don't want to keep in your bank account to deploy on growth, because that growth is likely going to be a really hard journey, an uncomfortable journey, and also likely the journey that the founders and other quote unquote good money investors won't be pursuing. And so you have these contentious moments that can lead to bad money. Then there's something called neutral money. And neutral money, it can come in various forms. I'll use only one example here, but you can expand it into various other categories. Neutral money is like family offices. And once again, a generality. But typically speaking, you have a very wealthy family who someone professionally manages their money and they're deploying it because oftentimes it's a passion project. Let's just say the father of the family happened to pass away from heart failure and they want to invest in a startup company with heart failure. They'll deploy the money and they'll give it. And of course, they're businessmen and women at the end of the day. So there's going to be some value add that they give, but they're not the professional venture capitalists who knows all of the strategics and they're going to open up doors and they have other connections with whether it's potential employees or vendors or supply chain, whatever it may be. And so when they dole this money out, it's really more, it's seemingly like philanthropic, because this family wants to invest into a technology or a space that means something to the family. But you're not, as an entrepreneur, when you take that money, you're not expecting the world of value add beyond it. And that's why I call it neutral money. And the great guy, Michael Nagel, who is now the CEO of Vomeris out of Arizona, taught me a lot about family offices. And they are first and foremost professionals. So you're going to get something in terms of at least a backbone or a sounding board, but you're not going to get the massive connections and the deliberateness that you will get from a venture capital firm. However, he made a really great point where if you have a family who has a fund that's $1 billion and you invest into a startup company that's raising a Series A of, let's just say, 10 million or 5 million or even 20 million, and there's a 5x return on that, let's just say, and call it 10 million for easy sake. So let's just say they take the whole round at 10 million and you return 50 million to them 5 years later, 3 years later, 10 years later. Is 50 million really going to move the needle on $1 billion fund? Not really, even if it's 800 million or 700 million, whatever it may be. So not that they don't care, but when they are putting their money to work, it's a lot more of mission and purpose and reason. And ultimately knowing that these startup companies who are raising their Series A or Series B, even if they do have a successful exit, they want the best for them, all of their investments, but you're not going to majorly move the needle for a family office of $1 billion. So that's like what I categorize as neutral money. And then the good money is it could be a corporate venture capital company. It could be Intuitive Ventures, the venture arm of Intuitive Surgical. It could be Boston Scientific's venture arm, JJDC out of Johnson & Johnson, just to name a few. So you have corporate venture arms, or you even have GlaxoSmithKline, bringing it back to Neurotech with Action Potential Venture Capital, which is really focused in, they call it using energy as medicine, right? So a lot of bioelectronics, et cetera. So you have these corporate venture capitalists who are able to invest in companies and also add the value they get from representing the big corporates that they're within. So maybe you need regulatory, maybe you need space to do R&D testing, maybe you need manufacturing. So that's value added. That's good money. And then same thing with venture capitalists. They don't necessarily offer the same value. It's just different than a corporate venture capital with the resources. However, a venture capitalist who has been there and done that before and has the network and has the know-how and has the wherewithal to go on the journey and understand how to do proper governance of boards and et cetera, that's where you get the good money, which is the value add beyond the check.
Yeah, for sure. So it sounds like good money versus bad money. It's almost the advice or the experience that comes along with it. And it is something that you have to be very cognizant of, maybe not as much as the team, because you're more or less spending a third of your days with the team, or half of your waking hours, or 2/3 of your waking hours with the team. But it is still somebody that you deal with on a regular basis. So it may be like the in-laws or some kind of other family. You have to be able to choose that and have it be good. Okay, so this is really interesting. Good money versus bad money. What are some tips for companies as they're raising money? What should people look out for? Okay, so you have an idea. What's next?
Great question. And I try to wrap my head around that a lot. And so when you say have an idea, right? Are we talking about napkin idea and you just start taking your first external money? Time and time again, I've been told this advice, especially in the early stages. If you can, pursue non-dilutive capital and funding as early as you possibly can, and honestly take as much as you possibly can. There's a lot of, whether it's the NIH, NSF, other grants out there, awards, contests, competitions, non-dilutive funding, and also investors later on when you go to raise either a price round or a safe note or whatever it may be with actual VCs later on, they like to see that you have received non-dilutive capital. I mean, it's another validation point that there's something behind the science, something behind the magic that you're creating. So if your question is, you have an idea, literally, where do you go next? You have your family and friends around, and it also just depends on the technology. So if we're really talking about white sheet of paper, you got to find capital from somewhere. Sometimes it's the entrepreneur putting in his or her own capital just to get the company off the ground. We hear that time and time again with serial entrepreneurs who have made an exit or two and it's just who they are, that they can't sit still and they're going to do another company, and maybe they self-fund for a little while. But in general, if you're talking about the physician who's leaving practice because they just found an idea, or the engineer who graduated from university or just left Medtronic because they had an idea that they want to go pursue, you start with family and friends, you look at non-dilutive options, and then your first and likely next step is looking at angel groups. Once again, these are typical professionals that have experience investing in the space, and they likely bring some value. They're self-proclaimed to not be professional investors like a VC, but you have, for example, in MedTech out of Minnesota, you have the Gopher Angels. Out of the Bay, you have the Life Science Angels. In Houston, you have the Houston Angel Network. There's angel groups that are banded together with people who have spent years and decades in the industry of MedTech, for example, and they want to start investing in private companies. And so they band together in these angel groups, and their typical check sizes on an individual basis are 10,000, 20,000, maybe 50,000, depending on the situation, maybe 100,000. But when you start talking about angel groups, angels can typically take on around between 250,000, 500,000. You start hearing some anomalies where some of these seed rounds get up to 2 million these days, but anywhere between that 250 to a million is probably the sweet spot for MedTech seed rounds taken on by angels. And once again, regurgitating what's the information that's been shared with me, the angel groups like to hang around a valuation between 3 to 8 million. When you start getting above 10 million in terms of a valuation, you start getting out of the angel bracket, and you have to start looking into more of those professional investors. And it could be family offices too when you get up to that level. But typically speaking, that's a guideline that I've been shared with.
Yeah, really interesting. That's a whole ladder of the investment route. Yeah. Okay. So how do you get in contact with these people? Again, like you have the idea, maybe you've gotten some investment, you have some traction, but it really seems these are the least responsive people on the planet, just because they get pitched so often, and you almost have to know them first to be able to get in. So how do you do that? How do you get in contact with these extremely elusive unicorns?
Great question. So what I'm about to say, there'll be plenty of people who disprove me. Cold outreach still works, right? I'm not saying it doesn't work, especially if it's only part of your outreach to investors. And that's just going along with the entrepreneurial grind. So when you sit there and you find a list of 100 investors, 1,000 investors, and you make sure your slide deck or your executive summary looks very pretty, and you have a nice concise messaging that gives a little bit of bullet points, that whether it's traction or market size or the executives who are now founders on the team, just to get a little credibility. If you send out 1,000 emails, it's just statistics. You're going to hear back from somebody. And even if it's 5 out of 1,000, it's 5 that you wouldn't have had before. But it's not a great strategy. Whether it's how I help startups in my fundraising strategies underneath Lifeblood Capital, realistically, which is representing a network of investors that I'm simply connected to. And if I can help these startups get in contact with them, I become this medium point, quote unquote, warm introduction. And you just amplify that. Whether it's the investors who've told me directly, entrepreneurs who have successfully raised money, a key to networking, or I should say raising capital, is the skill set of networking. Like I mentioned before, like it should be any skill set that's focused on for an entrepreneur leading a capital raise, or a company, a CEO who's leading a company. You have to be a voracious networker. That has to be a skill set that you have to spend a lot of time on that each week outside of your operational focus. But the warm introduction is key. And if you can find somebody who can leverage their credibility with their relationship that they have with an investor and say, hey, this is a technology I think you should see, open the door for Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so. Then once you get through the door, it's on you to pitch. And actually did a podcast with a living legend, I call him, Daniel Hawkins, who's currently the CEO of Avail Med Systems. He was the founder of Shockwave Medical. He was, I believe, number 6 employee in Intuitive, and have done numerous startups in between then. Part of that story that he shared with me was, obviously, as you've raised money time and time again, the process becomes easier, not because it in a real world setting is easier. You still have to do all the knocking on the doors and the pitching, et cetera. But once you've gone through anything like in life, once you have experience with something, you can cut down the timelines to get to the end point where you couldn't before when you were first doing it. And he even mentioned very clearly, when you have warm introductions and when you've built that network and you can tap other CEOs on the shoulder and say, hey, I know that you were invested in by so-and-so. We have an aligned technology with that investor's portfolio. Would you mind making a warm introduction for me? And it could come from anywhere, honestly. And then keep in mind, once you get a lead investor or maybe even an investor interested in your round, when an investor puts money into your startup, what they're saying is, I want you to succeed. And how can I help you succeed? If you're raising a $10 million round and this investor took $1 million of it and there's still $9 million left, they don't want to just forget about that $1 million. They want to make sure that $1 million is going to work. But the only way it's going to work is if you somehow raise that extra 9. And these investors, they're serial networkers. And so a lot of the job of, or I should say part of the process with these investors who invest in companies is to help syndicate the rounds. And angel groups do that and they know each other. Venture capitalists do that. They know each other. Corporate venture capitalists know each other, or at least other investors. And it's all about networking, right? And so another podcast guest of mine even said to me, it's like, listen, we used to not invest in a company and then share that company with another investor and be like, hey, it wasn't right for us, but it might be right for you guys. And they were like, after a while, I don't know if that model really works, because we're basically saying, we're not going to invest in this company, but maybe you guys will. We know you, maybe you will. And all of a sudden they changed it and they said, listen, we're not going to syndicate rounds unless we know that we're going to invest in that company. And so when they invest in that company and they say, hey, friends of mine in the investment world, this is a company that we really cherish. We're going to make the investment in this company. Here's the due diligence that we've done. We believe, based on our experience of either co-investing previously or knowing what your portfolio looks like, you should take a look at this as well. So this networking effect and this power of networking, whether it's from a warm introduction from whoever's available that you meet, that can introduce you to an investor. And then also once you start getting investors on board, they also have power in numbers and their own network effect where they start helping you syndicate the round. How do you meet these people? Warm introductions is the best. Have there been a plethora of stories that will disprove everything I just said and said, hey, if you sit in front of a computer and you blast out 1,000 emails, you can fund your fund or you fund your investment? The answer is yes, you can. It's just a much less methodical process. It probably will take longer. It involves a lot more luck and timing, and it's not a clean process. So it's truly a grind of networking, getting to know people who can add value to your story and journey. So ultimately they can help you network to close that round as quickly as possible.
Yeah, really. Wow. It definitely does sound like you have to be a salesman, essentially, to be a founder and to raise money. You said networking and going out to people and talking to them like dozens of times. And that's your job when you're doing this for many months is this grind of meeting people. So maybe the last question, because I know we're going to be short on time. What's something that you see a problem or what's a wrong direction that a lot of people go down that could be easily fixed?
Two things. So first and foremost, make sure you have an investable story. And even though whether you reach out to investors or even colleagues and friends and everyone's willing to help or maybe even tweak it, you have to keep in mind that investors at the end of the day, they're human beings. And I always like to run through this real world example. When you do your outreach, whether it's through a warm introduction or not, and probably this is expanded on if you're not going through a warm introduction, the material that you use and the story that you sell has to be investable and it has to be investor ready. And I think knowing what investors really want to see versus what you think you want them to know is a challenge, especially for a lot of first-time entrepreneurs. At the end of the day, going back to this human behavior aspect, when you found a company, a technology, it becomes your baby. And when you put together your 10 or 20 page slide deck and 18 of the slides or 8 out of the 10 of the slides or 7 out of the 10 of the slides are all about your product and only your technology, and it's just very product heavy, you have to keep in mind, even if you're a MedTech investor, and you look in their portfolio, they might have some cardiovascular focus, but even if they're cardiovascular focused, there's implantable cardiovascular, there's permanent implants, there's temporary implants, there's stents, there's heart failure, there's total artificial hearts, a lot of stuff. Think about neuro. You have pain management, implantables, you have wearables, you have brain-computer interfaces, both external and internal. So when you think about how many technologies they have to be peripherally aware of and experienced and deep enough, but never the smartest person in the room, because the smartest person in the room on your technology is you, the founder. When you reach out to these investors, you have to keep in mind, going from the human aspect again, what's important to them? How are they going to be able to align your technology with their investment thesis, with the long-term goal of eventually making money off of their investment into you to return back to their investors and make some on the side? So when you put together a deck and it's all about the product and it's just so granular and there's really no business components to it, it's not selling an investable story. You have to sell, especially for early stage startups, who's part of your team? Who did you convince that when you had this napkin idea that they were going to quit their jobs and join you and put their feet on the ground every day to create this technology and develop this technology? That credibility of who you were able to bring into your story, that's huge. So in early stage investments, you sell the team. You sell who wakes up every day to develop this company. How big is the market? Once again, I've been told this numerous times, you can have a great technology, but if the market's this big, and for all those that can't see me right now, I'm just making a circle with my fingers, it's great, but if you can't make a profit on this idea, is it really an investable technology, or is it really more like a passion project where you're going to go out and help 50 people? So going back to the investable story, you have to understand what investors are looking for. It's the team, it's the market size. Of course, it's the product. They eventually are investing in the product, but especially for earlier stage companies, the product is going to change numerous times throughout development. Once again, specifically focusing on MedTech. They're investing in the team and the passion and the future possibility and the opportunity of what this product could eventually be, especially on early stages. So going into what they're looking for, who's the market, or how big is the market? Who's the team? Do you have a scientific advisory board? Who else has invested in there? Do you have non-dilutive capital? Who else has believed in your story to be able to invest in it? Have you raised previous rounds? Who were those investors? So those are those check boxes that investors want to see. And oftentimes, especially with first-time entrepreneurs, it's their baby. The technology is their baby, and they make it very heavy on the product, and they sell very little of this business idea. And so when you reach out, going back to what I was trying to talk about, a long story here, if you sell a very product heavy slide deck and you send it out at 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, and it happens to be Easter weekend, Passover weekend, Christmas holiday, whatever it may be, and you are one of 50 startups who have sent a slide deck to them today, think about if you receive 50 slide decks every single day, and you're looking for reasons to say thanks, but no thanks. You're looking for the unicorns that have all their stuff together. Do they know what I'm looking for? Have they done due diligence on my investment firm? Do they know our investment thesis? Does their technology fit into our portfolio? Are they at the right stage of investment? Are they Series A? Are they Series B? We're growth stage investors, and you're reaching out to us for a seed round. Did you really do your due diligence on us? No. Pass. So knowing who you're going after, doing investor due diligence, knowing your audience, and then creating that investable story that's very concise, obviously has all the information necessary, tells a great story, and is well thought through. I think those two major things, to make it super simple after this long story, make an investable story, make sure your pitch deck and your executive summary are giving the information that investors have to do or have to check that box with before they just start going into the waterfall effect of all the minutia of your specific technology. Cover all the business aspects and the human aspects and the people aspects of who's along in your journey. And then also know that when you do click send on that email, whether it's through a warm introduction or not, do the investor due diligence, making sure that you're reaching out to the right investors. Are they really appropriate? And if they're not, they're probably not for a reason. And the chances of them reaching back out to you are probably slim to none. And even if they do, they're just going to pass. So if you're an orthopedic startup and looking in this investor's portfolio, all that they've invested in is neurotech and cardiovascular, Do you really think that you're going to be their first orthopedic investment? Probably not. And then you look at who's on the investment team. Are they PhDs in cardiovascular research? And that's the reason why they focus in cardiovascular. Are they PhDs in neuroengineering? And that's why they have a neuro focus. And I'm making this up, obviously, but an investable story, going through that methodical process and actually caring about that investable story from the eyes of an investor is number one. And number two, when you finally do click send, do your outreach to investors, make sure that you're doing the due diligence on the investor so that who ultimately you're reaching out to, they make sense. It also saves you time too, as the entrepreneur, because if you reach out to 1,000 and only 5 get back to you, and if you just spent an extra day or two doing the extra research and you only had to reach out to 10 and 5 got back to you, do the math on that, and it makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, for sure. Giovanni, this has been great. I guess last question too is what percentage of that slide deck should be about the people and everything like this versus the technology? And then where can people find you?
I think what percentage is probably subjective. I think if you're ticking all the boxes, that makes that investable story. Once again, going to the people involved in your product, in your technology and product. So whether it's actual employees and founders and their backgrounds, scientific advisory boards, maybe if you already have a board of directors or business advisors. So share who's a part of that story, the market, like I said, again, and then competitors, for example, who are the potential exit partners. If you're painting that business picture and you've done that, and whether or not you subjectively make it within 3 or 4 slides and your whole slide deck is 10 slides and you have 6 slides on your product, as long as you're checking the boxes. I just think when you start getting involved into 30 slide decks, 40 slide decks, and you need a PhD in order to understand even what you're sending, and there's only 1 or 2 slides on the business aspect, and you're expecting an investor to truly care, especially without even having an introductory call, that's where it starts getting a little hairy. I would strongly recommend, and if you don't know how to do it yourself, and it just doesn't come natural to you to be able to sell a very concise, investable story, ask for help. There's plenty of entrepreneurs who have gone through successful exits and raised successfully, who are now more than willing to share their knowledge or become mentors, etc. So ask around and think about it like this way. When we were all back in high school or even college, and the professor or the teacher said, all right, we're going to write a paper on this and whatever topic it was, and there was no explanation. You do all your research and you were like, oh, I don't want to write a 10-page paper. But you realize very quickly how easy it was to write a 10-page paper. And actually it went to 15 pages just because it started spiraling on itself. And the teacher says, actually, no, I want you to condense everything that you just shared down to 3 pages. All of a sudden, writing a very condensed, well-thought, structured story into 3 pages from what you created at 10 or 15 pages is really difficult. It's an art as well as a little bit of a science. It's very similar with the slide deck. Think about what the investors are looking for through their eyes, in addition to the information that you want to share with them specific to your product, and make it a flowing story that is concise. It checks all the boxes, and everything else after that can be shared throughout the due diligence process, which typically takes 2, 3, 4, 5 months. You have ample time to share a lot of information with them once they're already invested, or I should say interested. But in order to gain that first slide deck or executive summary, just tell a concise, investable story. Once again, not through the entrepreneur's eyes of what they want the investors to know, but what the investors want to know, and that's how you should craft your story. And that was, I think, your first question. The second question is how they can find me. My email, first and foremost, Giovanni@lifebloodcapital.com. So Giovanni @lifebloodcapital.com. Certainly, I'm all over LinkedIn, so you can find me on LinkedIn. That's a huge spot. And other than that, in person at conferences.
Excellent. Yeah, I'll have all that information in the show notes. Giovanni, thanks so much for doing this, and I hope this was very informative for our audience.
Thank you very much for having me, Layden.
Hope you enjoyed the show and were able to learn something new, bringing together different fields in novel ways. Until next time on the Neural Implant Podcast.